welcome you all, both of you here in person and those watching us live streaming, for joining us in this very interesting panel with Daniel C. Esty. He's a Hill House Professor of Environmental Law and Policy, jointly with Yale School, and Director of the Center for Environmental Law and Policy. It's quite a privilege to have such a intellectual with us to go through how trade is part of the climate change efforts and how this can become a solution as opposed to a problem to reality. But that being said, I'm going to just give you the floor to introduce yourself a bit and tell us about why you are here at COP29 and what your thoughts are on the process as we are where it stands at right now.
Well, thank you very much, and a real thanks to Globe and the entire Global Legislators Organization that has made it possible for us all to be here today, and Malini Mehra in particular, who leads the Globe organization. Again, I'm Dan Esty, a professor at Yale, but with a very unusual posture for a professor, because I've been in and out of government a number of times, going back to my participation in the original climate change negotiations around 1991-92, leading to the original Rio Earth Summit and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So I've been spending a lot of time on these issues over many, many years, and I do think we're at a critical juncture. Here in Baku today as the effort to pull together an agreement on the financial flows that will be required for climate change investments to be made, particularly in the global south. But of course it requires investments in the global north as well. We all need to transition from a fossil fuel-based structure of energy for our modern economy to one that is clean and renewable. And I do think there's a bit of a weight hanging over the conversation in Baku today, because it's not clear there will be the hoped-for agreement. But I do think we're at a broader challenge even than whether this COP can deliver that finance commitment. I think we can look back over recent years and see a rising frustration with the global response to climate change. And of course, we have been at this now for more than 3 decades. I myself have been in and out of the conversation across, I think now, 13 different COPs. And the conversation had moments of real optimism. I think when the world came together a few years back for the Paris Agreement, and there was a commitment suddenly, not just for a subset of countries, but really all countries, to take action and develop their nationally determined commitments, their own climate change action plans. There was at that time a sense that maybe the world was finally getting into gear. But I think there was evident here right now in Baku, but evident as well last year at COP28 in Dubai, a broader sense of concern. And if we just look back to where we came out of COP28, there was a big excitement around the government conversation in Dubai that led to a commitment to transition away from fossil fuels. And that was seen by some as a big breakthrough. I would tell you, as someone who's been in and out of this conversation over 30 plus years, we've said similar things, perhaps not in quite those words, but similar things over many, many years. And frankly, I think the big news in Dubai might be something different. There was a loss and damage commitment that I thought was a breakthrough. And it was after a decade-long effort to create a liability structure that looked backward at who had put the greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere in an attempt to hold them accountable. And I think, despite the fact that some of us would say in a realm of theory that was the right thing to do, in the domain of practice, that was never going to happen. But what we saw in Dubai was a breakthrough in thinking, where people said, let's stop looking backward and trying to assess blame. Let's look forward and create a fund to help those that get burdened with climate change impacts going forward. More in the realm of insurance than in the context of a legal liability. And I think that was a breakthrough. And I do think that's the challenge here in Baku and frankly for the world community going forward. How do we do things in new and different and better ways that really ramp up our push towards that clean energy future that we know we need, of re-gearing the foundation, the energy foundation for the global economy of the 21st century. And in that regard, my own view is that the big news coming out of COP28 was not the transition away from fossil fuels, but was a couple of other things. First, that 100,000 people showed up in Dubai, and we've got not quite that number, but maybe half as many here in Baku, signals to me that the world community is getting serious about this transition. And one can just walk around all of the pavilions here in Baku and an extraordinarily rich array of ideas about how to get from where we are to where we need to be. Ideas about technology breakthroughs, about finance breakthroughs, about public engagement, about how companies are going to transition to business models that are more sustainable. So that's very exciting to see. But again, the real story, I think, from last year that hangs over the conversation here in Baku today is the global stocktake that found that despite 3 decades of effort, greenhouse gas emissions are still rising, not coming down. And even where they are coming down, and they're coming down in a number of countries, and some actually were on trajectory to hit the Glasgow Climate Pact target of net zero emissions by 2050. Denmark, for example, seemed to be on that trajectory. But it's clear on the work that my team at Yale is doing on what we call the Environmental Performance Index, one of the metrics in that scorecard of country performance on sustainability is how close countries are to that trajectory of net zero by 2050. We found in a previous couple of reports that Denmark was on track, but our most recent report says they've gotten a lot of progress, but the pace of reduction is now slowed. And other countries like the United States are coming down, in fact, rather quickly, but from such a high base that it's going to take a very long time, and they're nowhere near the trajectory needed to get to net zero by 2050. So I think the question that we're facing here in Baku, more broadly out over the next few years, is what are we going to do differently and better? How do we ramp up the emissions reduction effort? And I think in that regard, and this is really the answer to your question, we need to see where there's points of policy leverage that pull people together and, in fact, hold people together on the transition to a clean energy future. And I can't help as an academic but to give a little bit of a theoretical framework here. We are at risk, a very big risk, I think, of ending up with what's seen as a non-cooperative solution, where some companies, some countries do not adhere to the commitments that have been made to bring down emissions. And when some don't adhere, there is, from the realm of game theory, a strong logic for ending up in others defecting from the commitment as well. And I think that's what we've systematically seen over recent years. And this is not a surprise. Again, in the economic sub-theory world of game theory, there's a well-established principle that when you're at risk of non-cooperation and some people benefiting from that, we end up in what is known as a lose-lose equilibrium, where everybody else breaks away from the commitment as well. And for those who are interested, that is known as the Nash equilibrium, and how you end up breaking out of a prisoner's dilemma dynamic where you need to cooperate for success. You end up with this very powerful, mathematically proven logic of non-cooperation unless you have an overarching governance structure of some kind that holds people together. So the question I've been posing is, what might that governance structure be? And the answer I've come to is really harnessing the power of the international trade system. And that's what I think we might want to talk about here today. How could we mobilize the World Trade Organization, but beyond that, the UN development structure, the International Trade Center, all of whom are represented here in Baku, and recognize increasingly that the trade system is a critical part of what's needed to disseminate at speed and scale the technologies, the services, the goods, the ideas for bringing emissions down, but also could provide that governance framework to hold people together, effectively hold people's feet to the fire, and keep everyone on this transition pathway together, preventing the defections, or we might even call it the cheating on the system that leads to a breakdown of that commitment to change.
Well, you mentioned the World Trade Organization and, of course, United Nations Trade and Development and International Trade Centers. Several people would argue that these institutions are rather outdated and need a revamp. How would you see, is there a need for a total overhaul for them? What would that look like? And do we actually have the time to worry about restructuring these organizations that came out in very different times when the realities and the challenges were different. I mean, science is clear. We, to keep 1.5 alive, which is, the drumbeat that resounds in these COPs, seems to be dying. What role could these, forgive me, but slightly archaic institutions, what role could they play in actually keeping this alive? Or are they maybe a hindrance?
So let's dig into that. I do think that the existing trade system, centered on the World Trade Organization, the WTO, but not limited to that, are in need of reform. So I do think we've had some lost momentum. But if we just take one quick step back to when they were created, in the wake of World War II, there was a logic to having people work together to promote a shared sense of economic opportunity, the promise of shared prosperity. And the theory behind that was put together by a guy named Cordell Hull, a longtime U.S. Secretary of State. And he argued, having looked back on the first half of the 20th century at the terrible results of 2 world wars and a lot of serious economic harm from the Great Depression, and said, we really need working together to go forward in a way that creates an economic system to manage the inevitable economic interdependence. And that was the foundation for the global agreement on tariffs and trade. That structure did hold people together, helped everyone commit to bringing down their tariffs, cooperating more, and generated, let us not forget, enormous growth. And in recent decades, particularly enormous growth across the global south. So there has been a big payoff to economic cooperation. And I think we're at risk of having that break down. And you're quite right that there is now a risk that these organizations, the World Trade Organization in particular, seem out of date. But I think the question is, would it be better to let them fail and the trade system fracture? Or wouldn't it be better to invest in refurbishing them, revitalizing them for the 21st century going forward? And I do think there's an agenda for doing that that's been developed. People are quite excited about it. And the key now is to really begin to figure out how to mobilize around restructuring the trade system and making it work to support not just economic efficiency, but a broader agenda based on sustainable development. And I just want to refer back one more time to this Cordell Hull and the theory by which he advanced the framework for a global agreement on tariffs and trade. He did it by reference not to economic efficiency and not to David Ricardo and the theory of comparative advantage that underpins, for a lot of people, the trade system, but he did it by reference to the work of French Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire and Montesquieu. And their work suggested that countries that trade together are much less likely to go to war. This goes by the French name of doux commerce, or sweet business. And the idea is that countries trading together, working together economically, are much more likely to provide a world of peace and security. And by the way, this Cordell Hull won the Nobel Prize for the ideas that he advanced that created the global agreement on tariffs and trade. And it was not the economics prize. He won the Peace Prize. And I think at a moment where the world is at risk of fracture across not just north-south lines, and inclusive for global south as well as global north, is a fundamental question. And I think you're hinting at some of the answers, which is to ensure that those from the global south who have some of the critical primary materials do more of the processing at home rather than simply producing the raw materials and letting them be shipped to other countries, whether that's in Europe, the United States, or increasingly in China. And I think all of that suggests a new division of the economic opportunities in ways that would give us perhaps what would be perceived as a fair deal. And I think beyond that, we know that the mechanisms for actually making this work to provide that incentive to pay attention to spillovers of harm, to these uninternalized externalities, has emerged in the form of the European Union's structure called its Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM. In effect, what Europe is saying is that if you want to sell your products in the European Union, you've got to have a commitment to climate change equivalent to that of the European Union, and that we're not going to allow in Europe products to come into our marketplace at a lower cost because people did not take the same effort put in the same effort to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And I do think there's going to be questions from the Global South. There are questions from the Global South around the fairness of this. But there's no right to sell in the European Union market. And I think it is the right of the European Union to say, we only want products here that share our commitment to a sustainable future. Now, having said that, I think the European Union is conceptually 100% correct. There is no place in the 21st century going forward for companies or countries to get a competitive advantage in the global marketplace by underperforming on agreed upon sustainability goals. And I think that's fundamental. And I think as a climate change guy who's been on this issue for 30 plus years, we absolutely need that structure the European Union's providing. So from a policy point of view, what Europe's doing is essential. Having said that, I do think Europe has got some structural flaws in the current framework of the CBAM, and it would be useful if Europe could address those in order to make this structure feel more inclusive and fair and appropriate, particularly in terms of the fairness to the Global South. So just quickly, what are those flaws? Number one, Europe is moving this all forward unilaterally rather than in a conversation that's negotiated. Number two, it measures the commitment of those producing goods that are going into the European Union in terms of their climate change parity with Europe around a single dimension that I think is insufficient, which is the express carbon price. And lots of countries in a diverse world have different approaches to climate change. And I think the European Union, to be seen as fair, has to respect and reflect those diverse approaches to climate change. So there is a need for some kind of approach that accepts rough comparability and creates an interoperability between different climate change approaches. And Europe needs to find a way to credit those activities in other places. A third dimension is that Europe is insisting that it will measure the greenhouse gases associated with traded goods on its own method. And if you can't produce the data that Europe wants, you are imputed to have greenhouse gas emissions equal to the worst decile of European producers, the bottom 10%. And that's a real penalty to the Global South, where often the data is not as easily produced and accessible. And finally, and perhaps most critically, I think the European Union has not answered the question of how you address equity in the doing of this border carbon adjustment. And the European Union has, surprising to me, been really quite unwilling to say, yes, there has got to be an equity dimension here. And yet we know in climate change, we talk all the time about common but differentiated responsibility. The trade system has a similar principle of special and differential treatment. And yet we have not seen that important element of recognizing that the developing world comes to the conversation from a different starting point, reflected in this CBAM structure. So I think there's work to be done if we're going to make the trade system deliver this governance framework. I think the CBAM is a critical starting point, but it would be best if we could develop this on a more multilateral basis that would give it a sense of greater transparency, inclusiveness, and legitimacy.
But we had on this the privilege of having a minister of Guatemala, the Minister of Environment, here on this very stage last week, who mentioned these regulations, which fall very unfairly on the farmers on the ground in order to meet EU regulations in terms of climate change, and decrease the income they could possibly make from, say, coffee crops and stuff like that when they try to export them to the EU. So that is placing the onus of climate responsibility on those who are least responsible. Meanwhile, the European Union is still subsidizing agriculture here, also having energy subsidies. And that seems like putting an unfair burden on a part of the world that is on the front lines of climate change, has suffered the brunt of it, will be suffering the brunt of it, is actually exporting migrants because of these impacts. And yet the onus lies on them according to the mechanisms you've mentioned. How do we address that?
So first of all, I think we have to be careful not to assume that it's unfair. I think it's unfair to fail to address climate change and leave the world vulnerable to massive increases in floods, in storms, in changed rainfall patterns. So the greatest unfairness of all, never to be forgotten, is to do nothing about climate change. And if the burden were to fall on the farmers, it's also an issue. But it can't be suggested that they have a right to keep going as they were, despite the mounting evidence, frankly, that agriculture is a serious part of the climate change problem. So I reject the idea that there can be a pass given to anyone, including the poorest farmers. I do think we have to make commitments that they can engage with, finance their transition to a changed approach. And the strategy that I've been working on with a number of thought leaders around the world over the last couple of years, that's now been developed as the VLAR framework for a sustainable trade system. And for those who are here in the room, there are copies of this document, or at least the policymaker summary, on the table just to our side. And that strategy for trade system reform does take seriously the need to bring the global south to the conversation. It also recognizes that there's some critical elements of existing trade system structure that need to be reformed. And let me just quickly highlight those. Number one, we need a trade system that encourages and does not undermine all of the country efforts through their nationally determined contributions to address climate change. So a starting principle for the World Trade Organization should be to say that we are going to, in the future, the WTO, assume that countries working to implement their nationally determined contributions are to be given the presumption of working within the trade system and not held out as somehow violating WTO rules. Now, that might be rebutted where countries are completely ignoring their responsibility to trade partners, but let's start with an assumption the trade system should reinforce and not harm climate change efforts elsewhere. Number two, to your point, there needs to be a fundamental rethinking of subsidies. And I would say in two directions. Currently, the WTO, when a government support for a particular industry, farmers, as in the case you mentioned, is challenged, the WTO asks only one question, and that is that subsidy trade disruptive? I think that's a mistake, because the trade system should ask a different question, and that is, what's the purpose of the subsidy? And frankly, the WTO, and some of you will know this, has, since it was created in 1995, had an overarching principle in the very first paragraph of the Marrakesh Agreement that set the WTO up, going beyond the original global agreement on tariffs and trade. And that original preambular paragraph says, and I'm paraphrasing, the goal of this organization is not just economic efficiency or opening markets or trade liberalization, it is to promote sustainable development. So I think the WTO's first question when a subsidy is challenged is, does the subsidy support a sustainable future or diminish the push for sustainable development? And frankly, things that advance sustainability should be given a presumption of appropriateness, and those that diminish it should be pushed back on much harder. And so you've got, in this case, agricultural subsidies, particularly production-based ones, which should be seen as unacceptable and should be pushed back on. But I think if there were subsidies for sustainable agriculture, helping those farmers in Guatemala to become part of a sustainable food system future, they should be accepted. And the WTO should say, okay. And I do think, by the way, the trade system could do a lot to condemn fossil fuel subsidies, the kind of subsidies for timbering in rainforests that lead to deforestation, fisheries subsidies that lead to overcapacity and depletion of fish stocks. All of this would be good for the WTO to be much tougher on, and yet the WTO should be more relaxed about and support clean energy subsidies, sustainable food system or sustainable agriculture subsidies, and other things that align with the transition to a sustainable future more broadly. And I do think another point the WTO needs to pick up, it needs to work with others, probably not do it itself, but convene others to develop the sustainability standards that will be enforced in the trade system going forward. You know, for example, on greenhouse gases, it probably needs to be done industry by industry. The WTO has already, in fact, convened parties to develop green steel principles. That's a great start. We need to have those kind of standards before we have border carbon adjustment or anything of that sort. And I do think to the extent those standards include experts from the industries, critical companies, the International Organization for Standardization, others with technical expertise will have better standards that are more appropriate and give greater legitimacy to the effort. And I do think, finally, the WTO needs to do more to rethink its own commitment to a principle of equity and fairness. I think the WTO's special and differentiated treatment approach to developing countries has not been particularly good. And I would love to see a much more vigorous effort, perhaps including the repurposing of what's known as the International Trade Center, kind of the little sister of the WTO and UNCTAD. And that International Trade Center, I think, could be repurposed, and this is part of our VLAR framework for a sustainable trade system, as a sustainable trade system, as a sustainable trade center. Currently, the ITC has a commitment to helping small and middle-sized enterprises in the global south become ready for trade. And that includes things like how to deal with tariff categories, how to post bonds. Why not take that same commitment to helping developing country companies, and in this case, help them meet sustainability standards with capacity building, with access to technologies, with finance for the transition required? It would be a fantastic new purpose for this International Trade Center. And frankly, I think the leadership there, led by the very dynamic Pamela Koch Hamilton, would be happy to have this new mandate, this broadened commitment, and frankly, a 21st century agenda for that organization.
That's really very interesting and insightful. Thank you. Now, I'd just like to take a step back and consider the geopolitical reality we find ourselves in which President-elect Donald Trump is on his way into the White House. We have leaders like Milei, and we have what can generally be described as a rise in nationalism and populism to an extent, which feeds off climate denialism as well as the need to protect local economies, protectionism per se. How do these realities, which are echoes perhaps of the 1930s, pose a challenge, firstly? Are they an opportunity? What role could trade help in actually building up a middle class that is not affected by these voices?
First of all, I think your reference to the 1930s is very important. And I do think that those who fail to learn the lessons of history are doomed to repeat it. And the 1930s were a very tough time. We all know that the U.S. put up massive tariff barriers in the form of the Smoot-Hawley tariffs. The retaliatory response across the world did lead to a breakdown in trade and, frankly, a Great Depression. So I think the threat of imposing new broad-based tariffs is a particularly bad idea at a particularly critical moment. And I think all of us here should call that out, and we should push back on it. And frankly, I think there have been some important parties to that conversation who've been far too silent. And let me point a finger in particular at the business world that is the beneficiary of these trade opportunities that are at risk. And I do think there have been too few business leaders stepping up to really push back on this terrible idea, this non-cooperative idea, this really bad idea that has led to economic chaos in the past, fracturing of the trade system, and ultimately the Second World War. That's a pretty heavy price to pay. And anyone advancing an agenda that even echoes that 1930s moment, I think should have a much heavier burden of responsibility for explaining themselves. Having said that, let me dig into the question on a somewhat deeper level. I don't think even if the Vice President, Kamala Harris, had won the election in the United States, the U.S. was going to be in a position to lead this transformation agenda we've been talking about. In fact, having spent the last 2 years on public service leave from my position as a professor at Yale in Geneva at the World Trade Organization, at the invitation of the Director General there, the very dynamic Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, who's thinking hard about how to make the trade system focused not on economic efficiency, not on the opportunities for big business, but on what people need to thrive, how we're going to meet the Sustainable Development Goals and what the trade system's role in advancing that might look like. And I think what she is highlighting is the need to avoid a fracture, keep people working together. And by the way, if there is a fracture, it's not on north-south lines. It's on an east-west basis. And it would be terrible, in fact, for much of the global south that would be forced to choose between trading with the west and trading with the east. So there is a real risk here and a real threat of breakdown. But here's what it leads me to conclude. For far too long, the world has relied on the United States with some friends in Europe to structure the trade system. If you look back at the discussions that took place leading in the 1940s to the global agreement on tariffs and trade, it's quite a funny picture, literally the picture of who's there. It was not many countries, a couple of dozen, mostly Europe, the United States, Canada, Australia, some others, a like-minded group that came together to build this trade system we have. And to the extent the WTO was built on top of the original GATT, again, it was the United States largely that drove that conversation. It was not ever going to be the United States that leads the effort in the current moment. And I do think we should step back and ask who can lead, because it's an important question.
Well, actually, I would like to ask you, who, in your opinion, who can and who should lead?
So let's dig into that. The U.S. is basically taking itself off the field. And that is true before President Trump won the election. So the Democrats and the Republicans in the United States seem to have forgotten the value of trade and forgotten why it was an important commitment not only to economic opportunity, but to peace and security. The European Union, I think, would like to lead. It is leading to the extent it's advancing the CBAM, but its unilateralism has left it in a difficult place with regard to rallying others to this transformation agenda. China would like to lead. It, too, has a deep commitment to, I think, a sustainable future, but is not trusted by many countries. Now, the country that should lead, in my opinion, is India. No country is better positioned to take advantage of a trade system that holds together over the next few decades. As people stop investing in China, everyone's next factory, not everyone, but the largest number of new factories is going to India. India already has an enormous services sector that benefits from a trade system that holds together. So if you look out over the next couple of decades, India would be the big winner from a trade system that is successfully managing these global economic interdependence issues. But the Indians, curiously, seem unable to see their own advantage and are not at all positioned to lead. So all the major players are either have fled the field or not ready to lead. And I think it leaves us with two groups of countries that need to lead. First is what I call the middle powers of the West, led perhaps by Great Britain, that's demoted itself from great power to middle power, but in a constructive way for the purposes of leading these kind of conversations where they might now be trusted in a way they might not otherwise have been previously. So I think Britain, along with countries like Canada, New Zealand, Australia, Switzerland, Singapore, Japan, Korea, are the countries that I see all as trade-oriented, long-time committed trade countries, ones that recognize the benefits from trade and are in a position to step up to real leadership, given their other strengths in governance, in economic capacity, in human resource capacity. But alongside those middle powers of the West, by the way, which could include some European countries in their own right, like Sweden, like Norway, like the Netherlands, like Denmark, where there is a commitment to trade, a long-standing commitment, as well as to sustainability. But I think the other block of countries are the developing nations that have come to recognize themselves as winners from the trade system. And I think this has become increasingly clear that the key to transformative change will be those developing countries. So let's just review who that would be. Some of them are obvious. Countries like Chile, Mexico, Brazil, that have done extraordinarily well in recent decades as trading nations. But others that have just emerged and are starting to recognize this: Ecuador, Peru, Costa Rica, and in Africa, Kenya, Morocco, Botswana, and across Asia, a whole set of countries, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, the Philippines, all suddenly aware of how significant the opportunities for trade are and how much their recent growth has come from trade. Now, it turns out there are still a number of countries, particularly at the least developed end of the spectrum, who are not yet part of the global economy, not really benefiting. And there's also some misinformation that's been perpetrated by some powerful voices that have suggested to the global South that the trade system is somehow stacked against them and they should not be in favor of it. And while I'm the first to say reform is required, I would also say that the global South has been an enormous winner for the WTO structure over the last 25 years. It's not perfect. Everyone can be disappointed that they didn't get as much benefit out of the bargain that set up the WTO than they might have wanted. And my analysis of the team in New Haven suggests that one country has taken far too big a share of the benefits, and that's China. And everybody else can feel a little disappointed because China's taken so much. But we have to turn our back on people like Joe Stiglitz, the Columbia professor, who I like to say is an example of the disease of Nobelitis. He wins a Nobel Prize, and now he thinks he's the smartest guy on everything, rather than on the narrow set of issues for which he won the Nobel Prize. So he does a great disservice in telling Global South countries that the trade system is somehow stacked against them. If he had gone to the first week of law school, as opposed to spending his time in the economics academy, he would have learned that institutions like the WTO and rules like those of the trading system support the small and the weak against the strong and the powerful. So the trade system, again, with all its imperfections, has been an enormous force of support for the developing countries. And it's disappointing to see the appellate body part of the dispute settlement structure at the WTO falling apart because the United States has refused to help support it and appoint new judges. And that, frankly, should be a signal to the developing world that they are the winners from this system, because it was that structure of dispute settlement that allowed the developing world to push back on the United States, but on Europe, on China, and frankly to win a number of cases over recent decades. Not always. Developing world doesn't always have the right arguments, doesn't always have the WTO rules behind it, but in many cases they did succeed. And the alternative, frankly, is a world where power defines the outcomes day after day, as opposed to the rule of law and principles of fair trade. And I think we're going to see a breakdown of what has been quite a successful system for the Global South, unless it is those very countries that step up and say, no, we want to save the system and we're willing to commit our leadership effort to remaking the trade system for a sustainable future.
I was surprised to hear in those countries you mentioned, you largely left out the BRICS except for India and China. Brazil, Russia, do they not have, and South Africa maybe have a role to play? And additionally to that, what about debt? What about debt? That clearly has a role to play in climate finance and also trade, because it's one of those things that keeps on sinking developing nations or global south and interferes with climate finance and mitigation and adaptation.
So let's pick up with Brazil. It's a great example. I think Brazil stands right alongside India as the country most likely to succeed in the next decades ahead if the trade system holds together. Huge exporting country, enormous agricultural export opportunities, and I do think Brazil is in a particularly strong leadership posture. So if you made me pick a single country that I would like to have step up and lead this effort, it would be Brazil. And of course, they've hosted the G20 this past year. They will be the hosts of COP30 next year. It gives them an especially strong position of leadership as an opportunity. I do think that the challenge that you pose for a number of developing countries around debt is a real one. And I think if you really want to push me, I would argue that the trade system reform agenda that I'm trying to promote would even be better if it were part of a broader Bretton Woods 2.0 conversation. So we're not going to just fix the trade system and repurpose the WTO, but also bring the IMF and the World Bank into this conversation and hope to have them re-geared similarly to be better positioned to deliver what's needed for the world going forward. And in my mind, that's a much greater commitment to helping countries get out from under their debt burdens and, frankly, to invest far more in the way of resources going forward in developing structures to support the investments being made in global public goods, which begins with climate change, but includes a broader agenda as well. Referring back to your question about public health and pandemics, there should be investments there. And frankly, in an array of elements required to really move forward on the sustainable development goals.
And the SDGs, are they realistic? Are they fit for purpose?
I think the SDGs are an enormously valuable framework for telling the world community what needs to be done to deliver a future in which the human species can thrive, in which all of humankind can prosper together. And so again, is it ideal? No. Is it realistic? Perhaps not in the short term, but it gives us a good point to aim at on the horizon. And some of these goals are closer than others. The world has done a remarkable job in recent decades of eliminating extreme poverty. It's not gone, but we've done a remarkable job. And again, we have to remember that was by cooperation, not by fragmentation, not by disagreement, and certainly not by a breakdown of the economic opportunities that come from cooperation.
And yet, we're finding ourselves in a world that is with more conflicts than ever before, more poverty than ever before, and these SDGs are basically the evolution of the MDGs, and it doesn't seem like we're any close to meeting them. And every year we meet for this climate conference, and it just, one walks away from this with the proverbial kicking down the can road sensation. Is that us just being negative, or perhaps you can shed some light on something hopeful to walk away from with this?
So I think one can always look at these big, complicated challenges like delivering the SDGs as a question of whether the glass is half empty or half full. And yes, we're falling short, but as I said, on some we're getting closer. And some we're in fact making substantial and measurable progress. And so I do think one has to celebrate the fact there has been progress on a number of these critical issues. Is there more work to be done? Of course. And on some are we falling dramatically short? Yes. But it does still, I think, argue for ongoing efforts together. And one of the joys of being here at COP29 in Baku is to walk through both the blue zone and the green zone and to see all of these pavilions, some of which are dedicated to specific SDGs. So you've got people focused on energy access for all. You've got people focused on water. You've got people focused on partnerships. These various SDGs are reflected in efforts all around the world. And what I find exciting and gives me the picture of a glass half full is to see so many of these groups that have actually mobilized on the ground transformative change. Sometimes only in a small number of places as a kind of pilot effort, sometimes more broadly across the world. But it makes me believe we're moving in the right direction, too slowly, but that we could continue to build momentum. Although, as I said, and really a theme of our conversation here today, I think there are real threats to the cooperation that's existed, and I'm not confident that the next several years will maintain that upward momentum. I think there's a risk of falling backwards.
Okay. Just to bring it back to trade and the future of the economic system, there are two words that circulate widely in these ambits. One's a bit of a swear word, and one's a bit of a token for everything. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on them. How do circular economies fit into the whole trade game? And better yet, what about, drumroll, degrowth?
So I think, and I've been in this arena of thinking about climate change, thinking about sustainability for 30 years, and I think there is no worse idea than degrowth. It is a fundamentally terrible idea and deserves no serious consideration. It reflects a failure to understand how different life is today from where we were a couple of hundred years ago because of growth. Now, one can say that growth is a positive thing and still recognize that it has downsides that have been not taken seriously. So I'm the first to argue that growth is enormously positive, but we need to be more serious about the spillovers of harm that have come with growth. And I do think if you care about sustainable growth and sustainable development, we need much more of a systematic approach to taking seriously those downsides. But the alternative of somehow not growing or slowing down or even going backwards, terrible idea, not to be taken seriously. And I think beyond that, we do know that there is an opportunity to do things in new and different and better ways, and we should step up to that. So I'm in favor of trying to reframe our approach to sustainable development, take it more seriously, invest in what's required to address the downsides as well as to promote the upsides.
So you sidestepped the circular economy, but I'll get back to that. Terrible idea, degrowth, but how is it possible that the measure of excellence and success is infinite growth on a planet with finite resources? It can't be such a terrible idea if that's the framing we're existing in. So I'm sure there is a different perspective of what degrowth could be like. And you just threw the whole thing out with the baby in the bathwater.
No, there's no value in that concept. Zero.
Please expand on that.
So 30 years ago, I wrote a book called Greening the GATT, before there even was a World Trade Organization. So I've been on the agenda of what you're getting at for a very long time. And I basically said at that moment, you can't take the promise of a trade system providing social welfare gains overall if you don't net against that the harm inflicted by the very same economic activities that trade is promoting. So I accept that premise entirely. But the suggestion that the alternative is not to grow, not to have economic activity is just a terrible one and fails to understand what has led to the thriving of the human species over the last particular couple of hundred years, but slowly over 30,000 years. And it is cooperation, it is expanded economic activity together. So one can take seriously that as a path forward and the need to net against it harms that have not been taken seriously. So I'm in favor of all of that. But I think the truth is those who have talked about degrowth have not looked seriously at the lessons of history and have not taken seriously the need for an approach to the world that fixes the harms but doesn't throw out, in this case, the real baby with the bathwater, which is the promise of economic growth.
And do you think the circular economy could have a role in that?
So I think the circular economy is fundamental, and a principle of no waste as where we should go, I take very seriously. And in terms of the work that underpins this VLAR framework for a sustainable trade system that we've been talking about, it was built on 10 workshops around the world over the last couple of years, looking at critical places where the sustainability agenda and the trade system intersect. And one entire workshop was on the circular economy. And I do think the trade system needs to be reframed to support that circular economy, to promote reverse supply chains as well as supply chains, and to ensure that we take back and repurpose materials at the end of life of a product. And I think that's increasingly clear as an element, a critical element of what a sustainable future looks like.
And if I told you now that we are being beamed straight into the negotiating rooms right across, right now, what is the one message you have for them? And one request that you ask from our leaders?
So my one request would be to remember that the history of the human species for 30,000 years has been around the benefits of cooperation. Starting when the first cave people realized that if you hunt together as opposed to separately, you would get not twice as much success, but 10 times as much. And the first farmers in Mesopotamia, not far from here, who first began to compare notes on how to make their crops grow better and learned that there were best practices that shared effort would identify and then proliferate. The success of the human species depends on cooperation. And I think we're at a critical moment where we need to find ways to cooperate, no matter how hard it is. And if we fail to do that, the promise is of a less safe, less secure, less thriving world. And my own argument is that a critical point of policy leverage is the trade system. It's a mechanism for holding us together, avoiding that lose-lose Nash equilibrium where non-cooperation is dominant and where the efforts to move together to a sustainable future fall apart.
And to lead on from that, and as a final thought before we open up the floor for questions, what would your message be to parliamentarians from either side of the House in terms of trade, the climate emergency, and a future that is good and free for all?
So I think parliamentarians are a critical point of effort for delivering this new agenda that promotes cooperation broadly, that particularly invests in a restructured and reinvigorated trade system as a mechanism for supporting that cooperation and advancing the climate change agenda.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a most insightful conversation with you. I'd like to now open the floor to our gentle guests who are here. Does anyone have a question they'd like to? Yes? Please say your name and where you're from.
Good. Thank you very much. I'm Honorable Lamin Sise, a National Assembly member from the Gambia, West Africa. I am very much overwhelmed you know, and I'm pretty much happy about the things you've highlighted and issues that the world is confronted with, and the way forward. But however, and let me start from where you've started the deliberation on, and the hopes for the, you know, for global collaboration and for sustainability and for peace and security. I have been following adaptation a few days ago, and sadly, they have referred the discussion probably to the bond, and probably if they don't meet any agreement, they will again push it to Brazil, and probably to next COP again, and this is not really encouraging, and it does not show the global solidarity. And we've seen those technicians trying to amend, you know, the Paris Agreement, and so many discussions have been going around there. But in the panel, in the discussion panel, you realize that during the consideration stage, the actual people doing the consideration were invisible. Were actually invisible. Were political powers, you know, behind the actual consideration. You know, so at the end of the day, they couldn't agree on anything. They couldn't strike a compromise, you know. And the more we push these agendas to go to another level, to the bond in June, to Brazil in probably November 2025, you know, the countries that are developing in the industrialization are emitting on a daily basis. And the countries that are suffering continue to suffer. And while we cannot still meet decisions, is this really encouraging? And what is your reaction to this? You know, mitigation, adaptation has been pushed to another level that we cannot meet anything. Commitments are not coming.
So I think we do have a challenge, and I think your point about certain voices being left out of the conversation is a serious one. And I do think, in particular, issues that affect those that don't have economic engagement with the world are the last to be taken up. And I would argue that we are seeing serious investments in mitigation because in many cases those projects have a payback. If you build a renewable power generation facility, you can sell the electricity. So there is an economic logic, a finance logic for those kinds of projects. Adaptation is almost always risk avoidance and helping people prepare for the troubles ahead. And that doesn't have the same economic payback. So I think there's inevitably a challenge. I do think there's a conversation going on here about new structures of finance that put capital forward not only on a basis that's going to have a market return, but recognizing that some of these elements will not have that market return. But it's going to be a challenge, and I think you're quite right. It's unlikely we'll get it all resolved here in Baku, and it'll have to be part of a conversation going forward to Brazil next year.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your question. Anybody else would like to have a question? No? Yes, sir. Prof.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm Takashi Hongo and the Mitsui Global Strategic Studies Institute, as well as the advisor to Global Japan. And I work at the private sector and the think tank, and now we are facing really a big change about the market economy. It is a supply chain risk. So our business model are based on a reliable supply chain. That is our assumption. However, now industry are requested to make a supply chain due diligence, particularly the social, the environment, and of course including the just environment and also CO2 emission. This is a really important aspect, but that means this is additional cost. And the efficiency of the market mechanism is deteriorated. But so the international supply chain, we need to make due diligence. This is really a big challenge for us. Do you have any idea about how to reduce or restore the reliability of the supply chain? This is the first question. And also you said the good subsidy and bad subsidy. So particularly the sustainability, the subsidy or support would be acceptable. But another supply chain industry are facing is concentration on a small number of the countries, highly dependent on some specific number of the country. That is leads a big risk. So how to balance the increase of the sustainable products production and avoid the concentration risk? Do you have any idea about it?
So I do think supply chains are going to turn out to be one of the most critical areas of focus. And recognition over the last few years, really stemming from the pandemic, I think, about the worry of a non-reliable, non-resilient supply chain has become a front and center issue for many companies. And I do think it has resulted in some number of companies, first of all, ensuring that they have, in no case, reliance on single sources of supply, and not even a single country as a source of supply because of the risk of rupture for a variety of reasons. Pandemic again, natural disaster, war and strategic conflict. So we know that there is going to be a push in that direction. So I do think trade is actually part of the answer here, because if you get more trade, you get more resilience. And if it goes in different directions. But it's also probably some of the logic for nearshoring and friendshoring to reduce those risks of disruption. And with regard to subsidies, I think one of the elements of discipline on the system needs to be that the subsidies are not producing market-dominant players. So you have to ensure that whatever subsidies, even if they're sustainability-minded, are not structured in a way to take over markets, push other people out. And there is certainly going to be a need for resilience purposes to have multiple suppliers, multiple competitors in every category. And I think we've come to see not only the danger of distant supply chains, but of reliance on single producers of anything as a bad answer for society broadly and for all the companies downstream that are dependent on those sources of supply.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. And the additional point is, but if they are sustainable good and provided advice, provided incentive or the subsidy, but now the global market, not a domestic market. So the monopoly, if we thinking about in the previous years, just the domestic market, but now global trade. So the globally, as you mentioned, that the dominant company or dominant supplier are there. We can provide a incentive too. So I think we need to change the scope of the market share, not only from the domestic market share to the global market share.
So I do think there's growing interest in some global scale focus on competition. And I think that there is an interest looking not only at the national level of concentration, but at the global scale. And particularly to the extent it creates a risk of predatory behavior on the part of those that have a chokehold on certain lines of supply. So I think you're hinting in a direction the world is definitely going. So thank you.
And with that, I thank you very much for your wonderful questions and for your presence here. And to those at home, thank you for joining us. And any last final words?
Thank you all very much. These are important conversations, and we begin that conversation here today, but it does need to continue all around the world. And I look forward to taking the discussion to regional dialogues on trade and sustainability that are taken to every corner of the world, from the global south and the global north together. So thank you all.
Prof. Esty, from us at Globe and at COP29, we thank you for your time and to you for your presence.